Michael Binion, we've got a really tight schedule, and you're the last speaker, and any minutes were shorter coming off your speech. So, if you've got a well-timed speech, let's get started. You're next after Germain, Michael. But we're trying to get everybody's attention here. Our next speaker is Germain Belzile. He's from the Montreal Economic Institute, and he's part of our Modern Miracle Network. And our last two speakers are both from the Modern Miracle Network, and if you haven't heard of it, Michael is who's the second speaker after Germain, and Germain says we can call him Jerry if we like, but I like Germain. It's about as close as I can come to speaking French, and so. But in any event, Germain is from the Montreal Economic Institute. He's here today to talk about, give us a perspective from our friends in Quebec. And as I say, I've met Germain over the last couple of years at some of Michael's Modern Miracle meetings, and there's a whole group of us who have similar interests from across Canada. And I'm as interested as I am sure you are to hear from Germain. So I'll let you say a little bit about yourself and then give us your presentation. And we'll have a few minutes for question and answer when we're done. So welcome to Alberta.
Thank you very much. Can you see me? I'm quite short, so behind the podium? Okay. Speaking after Ted Morton is, let's say it's quite a défi for me. It's a tough act to follow. Okay, so do Quebec and Alberta have anything in common? And do you have friends in Quebec? So I believe yes, but we'll talk about that. So first of all, maybe a word about what we do at the MEI, EEDM in French. So we're an independent research institute, so we work on public policy and more. We do original research. We're a little bit like the Ames or the Atlantic also. We've got about a $3 million annual budget right now. We receive no money whatsoever from any government. We're entirely privately funded. We also order polls from good polling firms, and we're very active in the media. I'm interviewed, I'd say, about 10 times a week, either in papers or TV, radio. And 99.9% of our publications are in both official languages. There are minor exceptions. When we do things with the Heritage Foundation, for example, we often only do them in English. Okay, next one, please. Okay, so how is Quebec perceived outside of in the rest of Canada? Well, I would guess that people outside of Quebec see us as supporting all kinds of green policies, even nutty ones and costly ones. We're completely opposed to resource development, and we're very hostile to Western Canada. Well, I think that the unfortunate comments by Premier Legault not very long ago about dirty oil can be an illustration of that. So is there anything in there that's true? Well, first of all, so I intend to take a look at how Quebecers act in reality. So how they use energy. Are they very different from Albertans, for example? We'll look at results from polls also, and from then on, I think we'll have a discussion about how we can get along. Well, first of all, Quebecers don't live in a fairy world with a licorne. How do you say that in English? Unicorns? Is that unicorns? So more SUVs and light trucks are now sold each year in Quebec than cars. In fact, SUV and pickup truck sales have increased by 246% since 1990. So you don't see more SUVs and light trucks on the road right now in Quebec than cars, but it's getting there because we still have old cars on the road. GHG emissions in transport are up since 1990. Total GHG emissions are down 11% since 1990, so we're certainly not on a path of minus 20% in 2020. So we have no lessons to give to anyone on that. close to 100% of our electricity is hydro. So we have nothing, we're just lucky, in fact. We live in a land where there are a lot of rivers that can be used to produce hydroelectricity. But this helps in our GHG emissions. In fact, we emit a lot less GHG emissions than the rest of Canada per capita. And we emit 9.3 tons per person right now, and I think that Canada emits 19.4 on average. So, but it's mainly because, not because we don't use cars or all the rest, it's mainly because of hydroelectricity. Cars and truck sales, I'm sorry, these next, I'll make them available, by the way. But these next graphs come from a study that's only in French, not by us, but by the chair on energy from HEC Montreal, my business school. You can see in red the sales of SUVs and light trucks, not the dotted line, but the full line in red, and in black, sales of cars. So in fact, now we sell more, and it's increasing very fast. People like pickups and trucks like Albertans. We're not different. Next one, please. Our energy use now, electricity is, our hydroelectricity is about 30, I can't see very well, 36%, but all the rest, almost all the rest is oil and gas, in fact. Produits pétroliers raffinés, that's petroleum products refined. Natural gas, gaz naturel. You have the percentage here. These are the other liquids are from anyway from oil and gas. So in fact, a clear, an overwhelming majority of the energy we use is oil and gas. We use very little coal, but oil or gas, and we don't produce any. So we import it from somewhere else, somewhere else. If we look at Quebecers' energy use in total, Quebec is in red right there, and we're just a little below the Canadian average, but we're above the US average. And if you look at other countries from Europe, for example, we're way up there. We're North Americans here, and we live in a very cold country. We're a cold province in a cold country. Okay, so we use a lot of energy, and we're rich also. Not as rich as Albertans, but this means that if you're richer, you have a higher GDP, you use more energy. So we need energy. The next one, please. So where does our oil come from? You have the different countries here. As you can see, we used to import a lot of oil from the United States and from countries far away. But now, in fact, Canada's, these numbers are from 2015. But in 2018, petroleum from Canada passed the 50% mark. So in fact, we have a little more than 50% of our oil that's coming from Western Canada mainly. And almost all the rest comes from the United States and a small part from other countries. So in 2018. So we need energy. We use a lot of oil and gas. And it mostly comes from United States, from Canada, Western Canada, and from the United States also. So we've been polling Quebecers for a few years about energy, and it's done by the Léger company. They're the polling company with the best reputation in Quebec. They do it very seriously. And we asked Quebecers if it's possible to produce oil with a profit, should we be producing oil in Quebec? And 53% answered yes, 25% no, and the remaining, well, they probably had some problems related with cognitive dissonance. In fact. Because they would like it maybe to appear magically, or maybe I don't know what we should use instead. But anyway, they did not want to answer the poll. Where should we import it from now? If we import it, well, 66% said Western Canada, And in second place, 7% said the United States. And after that, it goes down to 2 or 3% for Algeria and other countries. So clearly, Quebecers need oil and gas. They import more than half of it from Western Canada. And they're happy with that because, in fact, they want in a clear majority to import their oil from Western Canada. So they're not viscerally opposed to production of oil in the West, far from it. And in fact, we want to remain your customers. And another very interesting question we asked last year and this year also, what's the best way to transport it? Because it's not going to appear magically in Quebec. You have to transport it here. Pipelines was the favorite answer to 45% of the people who answered. Or of the people who were polled. And that's more than the sum of trucks at 14%, rail at 13%, and boat at 9%. So if you add the three other forms, it's less than 45%. So that doesn't mean that Quebecers want a pipeline in their backyard. There's certainly the not in my backyard syndrome acting here. In part, but they're not opposed to pipelines, in theory at least. And by the way, 13% that would like oil to come by rail, that's strange in a province that had Lake Mégantic not that long ago. But people understand very clearly that rail is dangerous. Rail lines go through villages, through cities. Trucks are dangerous also. I would guess every 2 or 3 years there's a big accident, very often on the Metropolitan Boulevard in Montreal, involving a truck carrying oil, and with it's usually costly and lives are lost. So people are not stupid with these questions. Now, regarding a carbon tax, we polled in a and we got these numbers out apart from our other numbers because we thought that they were very important. So we asked Quebecers how they felt about a carbon tax to reduce GHG emissions. So when they were asked if they thought that a carbon tax on GHG emissions was a good idea, if it let us attain our goals, our objectives, which are minus 20% in 2020, minus 37.5% in 2030, and etc. 76% of the people said, yeah, good idea. We asked the same question, but adding, well, even with that tax, we will not get to our goals. Well, it fell then to 62%. When told, it's going to cost you something, okay, well, they were less favorable. At 5 cents per liter for gasoline, it fell to 40%. By the way, that's what we pay right now in carbon taxes, 5 cents per liter. So only 40% of the people polled were okay with the present tax. At 10 cents per liter, it fell to 24%. At 20 cents per liter, 9%. And at 40 or 50 cents per liter, and most experts think that we need at least that amount to change behaviors, it falls to 2%. And I was really flabbergasted by this result because, after all, more than 2% of the population does not have a driver's license and will probably never own a car. Okay, so this means that people. You might think that people are opposed to carbon tax in Ontario and in Saskatchewan and in Manitoba and Alberta, but it's the case in Quebec also. If you ask the precise questions, they don't like that, and I don't think that the federal Liberals will be able to get away with that. I think that in the next, I think that the Conservatives, federal Conservatives, saw these results, and I think that that's going to be one of their main points in the next election. If you elect the Liberals, you're going to be taxed. They've already started, in fact. Now, There's a lot of virtue signaling going around. You know what virtue signaling is? So you signal that you're virtuous, that you act in a good way, but when it doesn't cost you anything, and when it's easy,
Or someone else.
when it costs something to someone else, exactly. So a lot of this is going on in Quebec. So you might think that Quebecers are in favor of all these policies, but when we ask the correct questions, they're not, in fact. So recently, hundreds of members of Quebec's cultural elite signed a pact to save the planet, which is pretty, let's say, they have a high opinion of themselves, let's say. So Céline Dion, for example, and they got a lot of press coverage, but they got a lot of ridicule also. They were told, well, Céline Dion, don't you fly by plane about 50 times per year? How much do you emit there when you do that? One of the elite women, she was asked about her big SUV that was so big that 2 years ago it got stuck in her garage, in fact. So, in fact, it got more ridicule than anything else when they signed this pact, and not many people followed, and a lot of people talked about hypocrisy. So I intervened on the subject at the MBI, and one of the ways I intervened was by showing that whatever we did in Quebec, we would not save the planet. Okay, so the numbers are very simple. Canada emits 1.6% of the world GHG emissions. Quebec emits 11% of Canada's emissions. Maybe you can show the next slide. So the global emissions are the big square in gray. So the square in red at the bottom, on the left square, that's Canada's emissions compared to the world. And if you blow it up, that's on the right side. No, it's the same. If you blow it up, that's Canada in red. Quebec is in blue. And our reduction in emissions, our goal, that's the blue, the powder blue part right there. So in fact, if I remember the number, in fact, our goal is to reduce our emissions, world emissions, by 38 ten-thousandths of 1% of world emissions. And in fact, in 11 days, China will increase its GHG emissions by that much. Okay, so that's our 30-year goal to reduce our GHG emissions. So people are, this attracted a lot of coverage in Quebec, and people are not naive about that. I think that they understand quite well that if we're doing something, it's going to be virtue signaling. It will have absolutely no impact on what's happening in reality. So we're basically throwing our money away if we do that. Okay, next one. So Quebecers are not massively in favor of green policies. They would be if policies don't cost them anything, and they would be if the policies are good, but you need some conditions for them to agree with the policies. Now, are Quebecers opposed to resource development and would they support green policies? Well, there's a clear disconnect between Montreal and the rest. Outside of Montreal, people are much more favorable to resource development, in large part because they have jobs in the resource sector, different resource sectors. Now, in Montreal, it's different, and I guess it's different in Toronto and also in Vancouver, the same way. We have oil and gas in Quebec, so I guess that Michael is going to talk about our gas. Are you? No? Okay, well, I will for you then. We have a lot of very high quality gas in Quebec, and it could probably be developed for a profit. We also have oil, not in the quantities that you have in Alberta, but we have a significant amount, enough to create high-paying jobs, to create wealth in Quebec. Not a game changer, but still a valuable resource. We also have the Plan Nord, the North Plan. We're developing mines in northern Quebec. A lot of them are opening right now. It creates a lot of jobs. It's creating wealth also. My daughter's long-term boyfriend is fly in, fly out in one of the mines, and he left on Thursday for a 3-week stint there. So a lot of Quebecers work in forestry. Also, we're the second province in terms of the value of the forestry products behind BC. So we have always been active in resource development, and we still are today. It's still an important part of economic activity, especially in the regions. So how can we explain the comments by politicians? Well, I'm also a student of public choice theory, and a few of the speakers today talked about public choice theory. So it's basically let's say the economic and sociological theory of government. So James Buchanan, who won a Nobel Prize in Economics for his work on public choice theory, once characterized public choice as politics without romance. So we simply look at what politicians really do instead of what we think they're doing or what they say they are doing. So if we look at our politicians through the lens of public choice, well, there are, I think, easy ways to explain what's happening. Politicians know the numbers. They will not create very expensive programs, green programs, unless they're completely hidden from the people. If people don't notice them, they will do something, but not much. They know that there's a very, very clear limit. So how do they burn their green cred? How do they look like people who are close to the environment and who want to save the planet? Well, one way of doing that is either making declarations that have little impact on the pocketbook of Quebecers, but that can please some people in the electorate. So talking about the dirty oil from Western Canada, for example, well, it doesn't cost a dime to anyone in Quebec, and some people will be happy with that. So I think that this is playing in Quebec right now. This being said, Premier Legault has a reputation for speaking and thinking afterwards. Okay, so and I know from someone in the cabinet that this was not scripted when he talked about that, and they were in, let's say, let's save the furniture mode after that. I'm using a French expression here. And I think that that's the case for most of what's happening right now. If we look at the pipelines, for example, well, politicians in Quebec have absolutely or have very little to gain or to lose if pipelines go through Quebec. Or they have very little to gain, I'd say. But they could lose some votes by people who are opposed to pipelines. So very little votes are in play, I believe, here. But politicians are very good at counting votes. They're not necessarily very good at inventing intelligent policies. I'm sorry for the members of the Legislative Assembly who past or present ones here, but I think that politicians are much, much better at counting votes, at least the ones who get elected. Okay, so that's their. I think that's their strength. So so I think that this helps us to understand what's happening right here. They're pandering to a certain part of the public. They don't feel that there are a lot of votes to get by, for example, speaking in favor of pipelines. I believe that I believe that Energy East, if we want to talk about Energy East, I believe that the company made big mistakes in the way they did things in Quebec, at the start at least. And I think that if they had to redo it, they should probably choose areas that are not as heavily populated. I think they should go north of the populated areas in Quebec. There's a big project that started that's on the starting blocks right now in northern Quebec for natural gas, a natural gas pipeline, and it's so far from inhabited areas that there's not much opposition to that. So I think that that's something that could be that's in the plans for the future, because I think that the door is not closed for a pipeline in the east. And Quebecers are not different from people out west. They hate mismanagement, mismanagement of public funds. There's a big scandal right now about what we call the fond vert, the green fund. So the money from the carbon market goes into that big fund, which is basically a slush fund, and the government is using that to buy votes and marginally to reduce GHG emissions. And I've calculated a year and a half ago that every ton of GHG not emitted through policies from the Green Fund cost $2,000 per ton. And let's compare that to the carbon tax, which is going to start at $20. And the carbon market is actually, I think, at $22 per ton. So basically, it costs 100 times more to reduce. So it's not. So it's just a way to show environmental creds to the population. But now people are starting to notice that it's a really bad policy, that the money in this fund is being badly spent, and it's not achieving any results. And people are asking, in fact, that people get their money back. So I think that politicians are going to start to listen to these voices now, that they're more numerous, and that, well, the MEI and other groups are getting these numbers out. I think that we have a big fight for information in Quebec, but when we get this information out, we get a very good reception, and we get some, let's say, environmentalists are really mad at us. Okay, they have very bad reactions, and they're not rational reactions. Okay, they're epidemic reactions. Next one. So what are the big problems, in my view? Well, first of all, there's a big problem with resource ownership. In the United States, if a company discovers natural gas or oil and it's under your property, well, the company is going to negotiate with you, and you're going to get royalties personally. So if you have a farm, for example, well, and they ask you permission to pump oil from under your land, well, you're going to get $50,000, $100,000, $200,000 per year. Well, that helps you like oil production a lot more. Okay. In Quebec, well, the government is the owner of of all that's below your land. So whenever there is a big discovery in areas that are inhabited, for example, in the St. Lawrence River Valley, and that's where we find natural gas, well, people don't see that as a good thing. They see that as a catastrophe, because they'll only have the disadvantages of this production, and they would see any of the benefits. So I think that's something that in the long term we should work on. And perhaps some companies should think about approaching people and offering compensation, in fact. And I think that, are you working on that? Or?
Yeah, I'm kind of messed up.
Pardon me?
3%.
3%? So I think that's a very good idea. This is the way to get people on your side. Another problem we have, and that you have also, and they have in BC, and maybe it's even worse in BC, is the problem of social license. I've written about that. I've done research on that. I've talked about that before. This is a problem that will need political intervention. In fact, social license is an undefined concept. On the lower right side, I believe. My computer is in French, so it doesn't help. So to more and more, when we started talking about social license, what we meant is that, in fact, it's important for the companies to make sure that, in fact, they have they take care of the interests of different people. So, for example. Companies out west, they've been signing agreements with the First Nations and a lot of them to make sure that they profit also from that. So that's not a bad thing. I think it's pretty good. But if social license means, but it's not defined officially, but if it means that anyone that doesn't live near these projects can oppose them, simply because, well, they're destroying the earth or whatever for whatever stupid reason, well, it becomes a problem. And we will never have unanimity for anything in our society. So if we give a veto power to a small minority of people, well, we're in deep trouble. And I think that that's a problem we have to work on. And I think that Bill C-69 is only going to make matters worse. It's increasing the power of the politicians. Instead of having the politicians having a say at the beginning of the process, this say is at the end. 10 minutes? Okay. And basically, with C-69, a company could spend hundreds of millions of dollars over many years and be told at the end, well, there's not enough social license, so we're not going to make it. So that's one of the reasons why investment is leaving Canada. And it's, by the way, it's tragic right now. Our foreign direct investment from abroad in Canada is decreasing rapidly, and foreign direct investment from Canadians abroad is increasing very rapidly. So basically, Canada is not attractive, and it's happening a lot in the resource sector. And by the way, Quebecers have no problem with tankers coming up the St. Lawrence River. So Bill C-48 is also something that is difficult to explain. It bans tankers on the west coast, but not on the east coast. Why is that? So that's completely, let's say, it's from, it looks like Kafka, in fact. Now, another big problem we have, I think, is equalization. And one of the reasons we're not developing our resources, and I think I agree here with many things that have been said, have been said earlier. There's a big problem with the way equalization is measured. I know that some politicians in Quebec have said in the past that it's not worth the deal developing our resources because we'll get pollution and whatever, and we'll lose most of the royalties through a reduction in equalization. That's called a poverty trap by economists. And it's what maintains some people on the dole. If they increase, for example, they find a second job or they get a promotion, they get $5,000 more, and at the end they keep $10 more in their pockets because they have lost a lot of benefits because of that. Well, they don't do it, so they keep in this. They stay in this poverty trap. So we're stuck in the same situation. Now, if our politicians had more spine, well, this would not be a problem. But this $11 billion we get every year, well, our politicians are not interested in losing that. So I think it's very urgent to, at the next negotiation, to change the way it's calculated. First of all, I think it should be calculated not on the tax base, but on a theoretical tax base, which means if you could develop your resources and you could get this amount out of taxation from that, well, that's the amount we'll calculate on. Okay? And it could be done in a matter of years, not like that, but in a matter of years. So let Quebec adapt to that and other provinces also. Also, I think it's important not to exclude hydroelectricity. And if we choose to practically give our electricity, you wouldn't believe how much it costs me. I have 2,400 feet, big condo in Montreal, and it costs me $1,500 per year in electricity, and I heat my home electricity. Okay, so it's not free, but okay, but this doesn't count. Okay, this makes, in fact, it helps us to get more equalization. So it makes no sense in my opinion. And I think that another problem is that not enough people are stepping up to the plate right now to voice their opposition to Greenpeace and all the others, and to voice their, let's say, the opposite, and in fact the fact that they are for resource development and pipelines and all the rest. And that means mayors, companies, unions. Why don't we hear more about unions? They have jobs involved in these industries. Workers, entrepreneurs, CAP, I think that CAP, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, is starting to be more involved, but it's 10 years or 20 years after, 20 years too late, let's say. So, okay, but let's do it right now. And by the way, it's possible. The CEO of Resolute Forest Products in northern Quebec, Richard Garneau, stepped up to the plate, and he sued Greenpeace for defamation. And they're basically a racketeering organization. And he had Greenpeace admit that what they were saying about Resolute was not true, but it was just rhetoric. Okay, well, good. Let's have a lot of people say that, have to say that in court. And I think that, and he was supported by his shareholders. So I think that it's important for the companies to step up to the plate also. The next one, please. I think that if we look at the priorities, we must change the narrative. For First Nations, first of all, in Quebec, most of the people think that First Nations are unanimously opposed to resource development. I wrote a research paper last year about that with case studies. In fact, we interviewed chiefs and leaders of First Nations, and I think we brought a convincing case that, in fact, they are not only not opposed, but they are strongly in favor of resource development, because that's the way to get out of poverty. And I think that that's the way to finally have reconciliation in Canada also. It's not only handouts from governments, but it's also having economic reconciliation. And that means, well, they have to develop also. And the only way for them is resource development. So I think that's a powerful narrative. And it breaks the back of the environmentalists if you can show them that, if you can show the public that First Nations are in favor. The Modern Miracle Network is doing a very, very good job in helping to change the narrative also. We have to talk about wealth creation, not only the environment. We're not talking enough about wealth creations. We also have to inject a dose of rationality in the debate. And I'm working on that in a small part with the MEI, because most of the time the debate is very emotional. And we have to, if we show figures, if we show numbers to the people, we can change their minds. And I have seen that a lot. And we have changed the narrative in Quebec on many topics. On public sector deficits, for example, it's been said earlier that, in fact, the biggest change around or turnaround in public finances in Canada in the recent years is Quebec. We now have a public surplus, and it's going to stay that way for years to come if they don't spend their way to another deficit. But if they simply maintain the programs the way they are, we have a deficit we have a surplus that will increase for at least 10 years. Okay, so we're in fact reimbursing part of the debt right now. That's a good thing because we had a high debt. But at least we're in. And we're certainly part of that change in narrative. We built a debt clock that we put on the web, and all the people in the media are referring to that all the time. So it has an impact. You can have an impact. subsidies for the purchase of electric vehicles. We have big subsidies in Quebec, but they're probably going to disappear with the new government. And I think that part of that, the reason for that, is that we published numbers on how much it costs. In fact, reducing 1 ton of GHGs emitted costs in Quebec $300 per ton, and in Ontario it was, I believe, $500 per ton. So that's insane. It doesn't work. So this plus the fact that people realize that having an electric car in a cold climate is not such a good idea. Well, I think that this builds on a new narrative, and people now would be okay with us abandoning electric vehicle subsidies. So Quebec and Alberta have a lot in common, I believe. First of all, we're two energy powerhouses. Quebec in electricity, hydroelectricity. We would like to sell more electricity in other markets. We need infrastructure for that. Alberta wants to sell oil abroad. It needs infrastructure for that. So I think we have points in common here. We have battles that we could fight together. Also, we have a common desire to limit federal interventions on provincial matters, which is not the case in Ontario. Usually in Ontario, people are more centralist, perhaps. But historically, we both had this same point of view about federal and provincial jurisdictions. And so I think we could build on these. And I think it's possible to maybe find points of common interest, and maybe to have, let's say, join together and do some things on these matters. So I guess you'll have some questions and or comments, maybe about some things that were said before, also about Quebec.
Pretty tight for time, but we'll take one question from Michelle Sterling. Oh, sorry, I don't want to push you off the stage. That wouldn't do much for federal relations, would it? No. Go ahead, Michelle.
Hi, thank you. I really appreciate your comments, because I don't think that Quebec people hate us. But I have a question about the French carbon tax. France imposed this carbon tax law that all of their investments have to have the 2-degree climate risk written into their projects. And a lot of companies in Canada, about 300 companies in Canada, like Bombardier and SNC-Lavalin and McCain, they're all situated in Quebec and in France. So how does that affect Canada in terms of the fact that Canada made a climate deal with France in April of last year?
I think the French are headed for a revolution, first of all. So I'm not sure that's going to be that any such treaty or whatever, however you call it, is going to stay in the future. I think that there are conditions to have a carbon tax. So I'll maybe answer more broadly. The first condition is that we don't do it alone. If we have a high carbon tax and China doesn't and India doesn't either, we're stupid. It will have absolutely no effect on anything. And it will simply cause a massive transfer of production, wealth, and jobs to China and India and other places. And the U.S. is not going in that direction either. And there are neighbors, our clients, and our competitors right now. So we cannot have high carbon taxes if our neighbors don't have any. And the second condition to have a carbon tax is that it be completely neutral. And we know how that turned out in BC, for example. Okay, so I think these are the two reasons why people will not accept carbon taxes. They know that they will be taxed to the bone, and whatever the promises of the politicians. So I think that what we signed with France has no importance, in fact. I think it's virtue signaling more than anything else.
That's good. Let's call that good. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Germain. Give him a big thanks. And,